I look so much like my dad, maybe not now, but what about if I do this?
If you're a fan of classic American comedies, then chances are you remember the unforgettable Don Knotts.
You drop that rock and you get over here!
He was the lovable, bumbling Deputy Sheriff Barney Fife on the iconic 1960s sitcom The Andy Griffith Show. A role that earned him 5 Emmy Awards. His comic timing, nervous energy, and unforgettable expressions made him a household name and a national treasure. Sadly, Don Knotts passed away in 2006. But during his final moments, something incredibly emotional and completely unexpected happened. While lying on his deathbed, his daughter, Karen Knotts, was right by his side, holding his hands and comforting him through the ordeal. She never left him, standing strong even as her father, the man who made millions laugh, faced his final curtain call. But then, in a moment that would change her forever, Don Knotts whispered a few final words to her. What he said, Karen kept it to herself for years, until now. And what she finally revealed, well, it might just shock you to your bones. Keep watching to find out what she said. Don Knotts' awful childhood. Long before Don Knotts became a 5-time Emmy-winning icon known for his wide-eyed stammering, nervous energy, and roles that made America laugh, he was Jesse Donald Knotts, a boy from a broken home in Morgantown, West Virginia. Don was the unexpected baby in a struggling family. His mother, Elsie Luzetta Knotts, was already 40 when he was born, the youngest by far of 4 boys. His father, William Jesse Knotts, was a hard-edged farmer, once self-sufficient but slowly unraveling under the weight of schizophrenia and alcoholism. Just a month before Don arrived, the family had to give up their farm. Times were beyond tough. The Knotts household was not warm. His father's mental illness often turned violent. Don later recalled terrifying moments when his father would threaten him with a knife. To cope, young Don withdrew into his imagination, building a private world that was safer, funnier, and far more forgiving than the one he actually lived in. His older brothers, Willis, William, and Ralph, nicknamed Sid, were practically grown when Don came along. They didn't connect easily with their much younger sibling. Like their father, they drank heavily, and while they often lashed out at Don, he still saw them as larger than life, especially Sid. Sid had a natural comic spark and could make the family laugh even in the darkest moments. For Don, Sid was more than a brother. He was a personal hero. Then tragedy struck. Sid died suddenly from a severe asthma attack, leaving a hole in the family and in Don's heart. It was a loss he never forgot. Desperate for comfort, Don turned to something unusual. A dummy named Danny. Danny wasn't just a toy, he was Don's invented partner, his imaginary friend turned comedy prop. With Danny, Don began to perform little acts, finding joy and confidence in making others laugh, even if it was just pretend at first. At Morgantown High School, Don began to come out of his shell. He was well-liked, funny, and even elected class president. But popularity didn't erase his self-doubt. He felt scrawny, poor, and out of place, never quite shaking the feeling that he didn't belong. Still, his love for performing only grew. By the time he graduated, Don was convinced he wanted to make it in show business. So he packed his dreams, his dummy, and his courage and headed for Manhattan at just 18. New York City, however, didn't roll out the red carpet. His first audition was a bust, and the big city wasn't kind to a shy kid with no connections. Crestfallen, but not defeated, Don returned home and soon enlisted in the United States Army during World War II. Ironically, it was there, while serving his country, that he found an unexpected audience. He performed in Army variety shows, using his humor to boost morale among fellow soldiers. It was his first taste of real performance, and people loved it. After the war, Don didn't abandon his dream. Instead, he went back to school. He enrolled at West Virginia University and earned a degree in education with a minor in speech, graduating in 1948. He joined the Phi Sigma Kappa fraternity, sharpening his public speaking skills and continuing to feed the performer inside him. From there, the world began to open up. Early career. Don Knotts spent nearly 3 years in the U.S. Army, from June 1943 to January 1946, not as a soldier in the trenches, but as a morale booster. He served in the 6,817th Special Services Battalion, a unit built not for combat, but for comedy. His job? Make the troops laugh. And he did, traveling across the Pacific, performing in the Army's touring variety show, Stars and Gripes. He wasn't just a clown in uniform, he was decorated. By the time he left the Army, Don had earned the World War II Victory Medal, the Philippine Liberation Medal, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, with 4 Bronze Service Stars, the American Campaign Medal, the Good Conduct Medal, a Marksman Badge for the M1 carbine, and the Honorable Service Lapel Pin. He may have joined the Army to escape small-town life and a rough childhood, but he left with purpose, poise, and a stage presence. After being discharged as a Technician Grade 5, equal to a corporal, Knotts returned to familiar ground, West Virginia University. This time, it was different. He wasn't just a student. He was a veteran with stories to tell, timing to refine, and a stage presence molded by wartime crowds. On campus, he embraced the spotlight, performing regularly and rebuilding his confidence. But something else happened during this second run at college. Something much more personal. He fell in love. Knotts met and married Kay Metz, a relationship that would shape his post-college life. With a degree in education and a minor in speech under his belt, and a wife by his side, Knotts packed up his hopes once again, and this time headed back to New York City, determined to make it. This time, he wasn't an unknown hopeful. Thanks to the military connections he made during his service, doors began to open. He hit the comedy club circuit, telling jokes in smoky rooms. He landed a role on the radio Western Bobby Benson and the B-Bar-B Riders as Windy Wales, a smart-mouthed, know-it-all character with fast quips and sharper timing. Then came his television debut, a regular role on the soap opera Search for Tomorrow from 1953 to 1955. It wasn't comedy, but it got him on screen and into living rooms across America. But it was in 1956 that things really took off. That year, Knotts landed a spot on The Steve Allen Show, joining a comedy ensemble that would change everything. He became known for playing a twitchy, bug-eyed, nervous man in Allen's mock interviews. It was pure gold. Audiences loved it. The character wasn't far from Knotts himself, anxious, wiry, unsure. But he turned those traits into pure magic. Off-screen, his chemistry with fellow rising star Andy Griffith was already bubbling. From 1955 to 1957, the two performed side by side on Broadway in No Time for Sergeants. Knotts played 2 hilarious roles, a wide-eyed preacher and a bumbling corporal named Manuel Dexterity. When the play was adapted into a film in 1958, Knotts reprised his role, stealing scenes with his twitchy charm while Griffith took the lead. That role, an Air Force test administrator slowly unraveling in front of a country bumpkin, hinted at what was to come. It was the beginning of one of the greatest comedy duos in American TV history. Don Knotts had finally arrived. Don Knotts' first wife. When Catherine Metz met Don Knotts, she wasn't just anyone. She was the daughter of a minister, smart, refined, and raised to do things by the book. On paper, she had nothing in common with Don, a skinny, jittery, wisecracking kid from a hard life. But love doesn't care about paper. Knotts didn't back off. He leaned in with charm, humor, and relentless wit. He hit her with his best material, and before long, she was hooked. Catherine broke off her engagement and started seeing Don. 2 years later, they tied the knot. But love was only part of the plan. Knotts still wanted something bigger, something he'd dreamed about since childhood, when imaginary friends were his only audience. He wanted to make it, not just scrape by, to really make it. So, in 1949, with a brand new wife and just $100 in his pocket, Knotts took the plunge again. They left West Virginia behind and headed to New York City, a place that had already chewed him up once. This time wasn't much different. He knocked on the same kinds of doors, and again, the casting directors passed. Too awkward, too nervous, too weird. He didn't have the looks or the presence they wanted, and even his comedy, polished by war stages and college shows, didn't seem to hit the mark in the city that never sleeps. Still, he kept grinding. Little by little, small roles trickled in, mostly radio gigs. One of his first recurring roles was on a children's western called Bobby Benson and the B-Bar-B Riders, where he played Windy Wales, a fast-talking side character with a sharp tongue. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid. And more importantly, it kept him going. Knotts may not have been an overnight sensation, but he was climbing. Patiently, persistently, one joke at a time. 7 years of work flew by before Don got his first big role in a Broadway comedy, No Time for Sergeants. Even with his big moment on Broadway, his biggest takeaway from the show was the co-star he met, who'd eventually change his life forever, Andy Griffith. Things were looking up for Don, but every upside has its drawbacks. His role on Broadway launched Knotts into several opportunities. However, he appeared far different than the traditional leading man. In fact, he was consistently cast in goofy sidekick roles that made the main stars of his projects appear even more heroic. Most actors hate the idea of being tied to one type of character, and Don was likely no different. Still, his biggest role of all would tie him even tighter to playing the role of the silly sidekick. The Andy Griffith Show. In 1960, Knotts saw his old friend Andy Griffith on the pilot of a new show and had an idea. He called Griffith up, telling him rather jokingly that he'd need a deputy on the show and that it should be him. Griffith connected Knotts to the show's production, and the rest, as they say, is history. The Andy Griffith Show served as the stage for the most recognized and awarded role of his life as Sergeant Barney. The show may have been a smashing success, but things in Knotts' personal life were anything but. Knotts' chemistry with Andy Griffith was as clear as day, and you can judge for yourself on a TV Land rerun of The Andy Griffith Show. However, his wife didn't fit in with the show's crowd nearly as well. Reports say she didn't get along with Andy's wife, and sadly, it seemed she didn't really get along with her husband either. As far as TV viewers were concerned, Knotts flourished as Griffith's co-star, the pair bringing laughter and warmth to American homes weekly. Filming the show was hard work, and Knotts took his comedy seriously. If the outcome of his own relationships is any evidence, though, he didn't take care of his own home nearly as well. 10-hour long days on the set of a hit show eventually started to wear on Don Knotts' family, especially his wife, Catherine. The more famous and busy Knotts became, the more the two grew apart. They divorced 13 years and 2 kids into their marriage. It could have been that Knotts was just too busy for his family, but it seemed like more sinister factors were at work. Don Knotts struggled with anxiety. Knotts struggled to cope with his life as a comic long before he hit it big in the 1960s. In fact, back when he did smaller live performances, he'd be unable to get out of bed for hours, and sometimes even days, before a performance. He often played a nervous man on stage as a joke. As it turns out, his own personal fears weren't nearly as amusing. Knotts had anxiety, and his pre-performance anxiety affected him so much that doctors put him on anxiety medication in the 1950s. Like many Hollywood performers, it was unsurprising that Knotts eventually found himself too dependent on the pills, adding addiction to his troubles. Perhaps he could have managed life with anxiety, but Knotts had far worse issues. Knotts often felt physically ill, so much so that he'd exhibit symptoms in a state of hypochondria. In short, he tricked himself into thinking he was sick when he was actually perfectly well. This no doubt interfered with his personal life, and he certainly tried his best to cope. Eventually, though, things got so bad that he felt he had no choice but to turn to professionals for help. Professionals were able to help, but ultimately, Knotts had already tricked his mind too far. Sure, his newfound fame gave him the life of wealth, women, and success he dreamed of, but his past continued to haunt him. Knotts fought to overcome the memories of his challenging childhood, and even cursed God in a therapy session as he tried to find a way to cure himself. Sick, anxious, and depressed, Knotts also struggled with insomnia, and all his mental troubles eventually led him down a rabbit hole, leaving the Andy Griffith Show. In his life, Don Knotts won a total of 5 Emmy Awards for his role on The Andy Griffith Show. But neither the show's success nor his close friendship with Andy was enough to keep him there. The show would continue for several more seasons, but Knotts officially left in 1965 because he believed the series would end after 5 seasons. He had a 5-year contract and began exploring other opportunities, including a movie contract with Universal. While he was open to returning to the show, he ultimately focused on his movie career. While he left as a regular cast member, Knotts did return to The Andy Griffith Show for a handful of guest appearances over the next few seasons. Audiences felt like the actor's departure diminished the quality of The Andy Griffith Show. His daughter said that Knotts left due to the daily grind of working on television. Filming a television is certainly hard work, but apparently, that wasn't the only thing filling up Knotts' schedule. Knotts, the ladies' man. Although his first marriage ended in disaster, Knotts certainly didn't let that keep him off the market. He regularly played second fiddle on screen, but off-screen, he dated women profusely, with other celebrities considering him every bit a ladies' man. He may have been hitting it out of the park in the dating world, but unfortunately, it all got to his head. In 1969, Knotts landed a role as the lead in the raunchy comedy film The Love God. He played a magazine owner who'd revive his business by publishing much more racy material, turning him into a popular bachelor. Knotts jumped at the chance to play something opposite to the beloved Sergeant Barney, but he didn't play the bachelor in the film nearly as well as he did in real life. Some critics loved the movie, but it ultimately failed, and many theaters didn't even show it. Audiences just couldn't accept Knotts as a Don Juan, and he'd never try a role quite like that again. He didn't seem ready to give up on a career as a leading man, but if his next steps proved anything, maybe he should have. Knotts turned his attention to film and even signed a huge deal with Universal. He led several comedy films in the years to follow, including The Incredible Mr. Limpet and The Reluctant Astronaut. None of these films received anywhere near the acclaim of his work on TV, and Knotts could feel it. He went back to the drawing board, but without much luck. In 1970, The Don Knotts Show aired for the very first time. Knotts had signed on to host his own variety show, and the expectations for its success were through the roof. However, with Knotts competing with several other popular variety shows at the time, it was a disastrous flop. The time came to accept that his career wasn't going to look quite the way it did in his wildest dreams. 10 years of running around with dozens of beautiful women likely tired Knotts out, as he found himself in love again, this time with the gorgeous Loralee Chuchnya. Much of their relationship remained private, but what didn't remain private was the fact that Knotts' life continued to spiral. He just couldn't seem to keep everything together. The diagnosis. With his career stabilized and his love life in order, Knotts should have been able to celebrate. But he soon realized he was struggling to do common things like read, drive, and even recognize faces. His eyes were blurry. When he finally got checked out by medical professionals, the truth was worse than he could have imagined. Doctors diagnosed Knotts with macular degeneration. The comedy star was losing his eyesight, and quickly. Getting that kind of news could throw anyone off. And, unfortunately, Knotts was no different. He might have been thinking about the way blindness might end his career, but his eyesight wasn't the worst thing. The idea of losing his eyesight put him into a downward spiral. According to his wife at the moment, Loralee, the diagnosis pushed him to live out some sort of bucket list. Whatever it was that filled the to-do list, Knotts was certainly depressed, and he allowed his worry and frustration to affect those he loved most. It proved all too much for Loralee. After almost 10 years of marriage, he and Loralee divorced in 1983. According to her, his impending blindness and his dramatic response to it put the final nail in the coffin. Luckily for Knotts, he could afford the best care and had eye surgery that ultimately restored his vision. Tragically, more trouble lurked around the corner. We all have our vices, and one of Knotts's was his smoking habit. The habit was definitely trendy among other celebrities during his time in Hollywood. To his credit, he did eventually ditch the habit as he got older, perhaps as the risks started to become more well-known. But the damage was already done, and his attempt at reform came too late. Doctors diagnosed Knotts with lung cancer in the early 2000s, even though he put the bad habit away more than 10 years before. After all, he'd beaten blindness and therefore felt hopeful about his survival. Perhaps that was the reason he handled it in an unusual way. Even when it became clear that he needed chemotherapy, Knotts kept the seriousness of his diagnosis away from his children. He had a reputation for making everyone laugh, including his children, and likely wanted to keep things light. Knotts was also so sure that he'd beat his cancer. He clearly held out hope, so much so that he still proceeded with a major life change. The woman who got it all. Back in 1987, Knotts worked on a sitcom called What a Country. He was already older and in his 60s, and production hired a young and beautiful actress, Francie Yarborough, to assist Knotts with committing his lines to memory. Although the show itself didn't turn out to be anything very special, his meeting with Frances must have been, considering what he did when he saw her again. Despite their gaping, decades-long age difference, the two fell in love. Frances said she ultimately fell for his vulnerability, and the two married in 2002. Unfortunately, we'll never truly know if this was the love Knotts was always searching for, as they'd run out of time together far too soon. In 2006, Knotts' condition took a tragic turn. Chemotherapy wasn't enough to combat his cancer, and he developed further complications induced by his cancer diagnosis. His condition progressed beyond being able to be helped by staying in the hospital, and he returned home. Dying or not, though, Knotts kept up his antics to the very end. His final wife of only 4 years inherited millions in property once he passed. She left her time with him richer than ever. What did Don Knotts' daughter say? If ever there was a man who lived for laughter, It was Don Knotts. Right up until the very end, he remained true to what defined him. Not fame, not awards, not even Barney Fife. What truly defined Don Knotts was his unwavering ability to make people laugh, even when he had every reason not to. In his final days, hospitalized and weakened, Don Knotts didn't let go of the role he had played his whole life. The one-man show with impeccable timing. According to his daughter, Karen, even as he neared the end, he found ways to crack jokes and keep the room in stitches. When he was dying, she recalled, he was making us laugh in hysterics. He was literally dying, but he did something or said something that caused my stepmother and me to go into fits of laughter. But in the rawness of that moment, Karen did what she now regrets. She ran out of the room. Not because she was sad, but because she was laughing so hard she couldn't stand the thought of doing so in front of her dying father. I thought to myself, I don't want to be standing there in front of this man, my dearly beloved father, who's dying and laughing. Years later, she shared the story in an interview with Closer Weekly, and a director friend, Howard Storm, offered a different perspective. You should have stayed and laughed out loud. That's what comedians live for, Karen agreed. He was right, she said. I should have just stood there and burst out laughing. Because that's exactly what Don would have wanted. Don Knotts wasn't just funny on screen. He was funny to his core. In an interview with the Emmy TV legends, Don reflected on where his humor came from. I think it was because I grew up around comedy with my brothers, especially my brother Shadow. I think it just became a part of my whole person. I don't think I ever did consciously think about it. It just became instinctive. Instinctive. That's a word that comes up a lot when people talk about Don Knotts. His daughter Karen described it best when she said, being funny was just something so natural. It was a gene or, well, I don't know what it was, except that it was just an out-of-control natural funniness. He didn't rehearse his warmth. He didn't study his humor. It just poured out of him like breath. Making others laugh wasn't something he tried to do. It was something he had to do. In the end, Don Knotts gave his final performance the same way he gave all the ones before it, with a smile, a quip, and the goal of leaving his audience a little lighter. And even though his daughter stepped out during his final punchline, the laughter he left behind will echo through generations. Because Don Knotts didn't just leave us memories. He left us joy and unforgettable characters, reuniting once again. Although time and distance had caused Don Knotts and Andy Griffith to drift apart over the years, the bond they built during the Andy Griffith Show never truly faded. In Knotts' final days, that bond quietly re-emerged, just as meaningful, just as unshakable. Griffith made his way to Don's bedside at UCLA Medical Center, refusing to let their friendship end without a goodbye. Though Knotts couldn't speak, Griffith knew his old friend could still hear him. I was with him until about 6 o'clock or 6:30 that night, Griffith said in an interview with Larry King. He couldn't respond, but I did. I was able to tell him I loved him, and I asked him to breathe, breathe, keep breathing, Jess. The nickname Jess wasn't public knowledge. Don had once confided in Andy that his real name was Jesse, a name he never liked. But Griffith, being Griffith, gently reclaimed it in that private, sacred moment of farewell. He let me know it one time, Andy said, and I always called him Jess. In response, Knotts moved his shoulder slightly. His way of saying, I hear you, I'm still here. It was small, but unmistakable. And Griffith, ever the intuitive friend, understood. Later in the interview, King asked if they knew it was the end. I'm afraid we did, Griffith admitted somberly. We didn't. I didn't know it up until about that time. We were there, and they were very nice to us at UCLA. Griffith shared that, while waiting near the emergency room, He and others heard the doctor tell Don's wife, Francie, that his heart had stopped in the ambulance but had been restarted. "Yes, we knew," Griffith said. "It was coming." Don Knotts passed away on February 24, 2006, at the age of 81. Many entertainers consider Don Knotts an inspiration, regardless of what he himself thought about his achievements. He didn't do everything he thought he would, but he did far more than many in his same position. A statue in his honor stands in his hometown of Virginia, and you can still enjoy him on television and film on many stations and streaming services. What do you think about Don Knotts? Did his character on The Andy Griffith Show ever make you laugh? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to check out the next video on your screen. You will enjoy it.